aphorisms. Aphorisms don't quite equate to what we would refer to as hikam in our civilization. Is something which needs to be placed. One of the interesting things that we are doing and have to do is to locate a discourse for our own conversations with ourselves, with others, with our heritage, with the divine, within the literary, linguistic, lexical possibilities of the English language. It's a subtle transplantation that is taking place. Unavoidable, but exactly what register do we use? What is our attitude to this formidable linguistic juggernaut that continues to forge ahead through poetry, theatre, film, screenplays, the novel, and so forth? What do we have to say to it? How do we inhabit its rich landscape? Well, we inhabit it, of course, not just one language, but a panoply of languages in the past. Although there is a privileged relationship between revelation and the Arabic language, when we look at the history of Islam's use of language, we find some funny things. If we're to look at, say, a map of how Islam and its take on reality has spread historically, geographically, beginning with the original Arabian matrix and currently reaching the English language. And I was in Iceland this summer looking at some Icelandic Islamic calligraphy, and on, the grid of meanings of revelation finding a place for itself that isn't a betrayal in a huge variety of languages with their associated worldviews. One of the funny things that we find is that although the original matrix is Arabic, إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ قُرْآنًا عَرَبِيًّا, the Qur'an has been revealed as an Arabic Qur'an, there is a strange denial of particularity in that, which is to say that it is the Arabic language that's stripped of the beliefs and the values which historically have shaped it. One of the strange things that the Qur'an does really is to make the Arabic language anew. For millennia, who knows how many millennia, it had been the vehicle for conveying an essentially tribal, this worldly, rather melancholic and polytheistic worldview. And suddenly the language was called upon to convey something that was more or less its opposite. And in the process of that, it became paradoxically a springboard whereby it very quickly inhabited and transformed an indefinite range of linguistic spaces. A language is like a universe. It has its own rhythm, its own way of parceling out reality between concepts, its own way of apprehending the miracle of what is. This is the Allamahul Bayan. The strangest thing really that we can do about reality is to name it, to speak about it, to conceptualize it, and we can only do that in the context of language. Each language has its own way of parceling out reality. And one of the most interesting things that Islam as universal civilization has to do is to see how it can take the coordinates and the semantics of different languages, including languages that have been historically shaped, as most of them have, by profoundly non-Islamic worldviews, and to turn them into vehicles not just for the functional expression of Islamic truth claims, but as springboards for a new and intoxicating literature. So we find, as one of the paradoxes of this process, that even though in the pre-Islamic period, the great cultural production of the Arabs was the poem, didn't really have much else by way of architecture or music or anything, but they had the poem, that following the rise of Islam, that although Arabic poetry continued in a diversifying and distinguished way, the principle, as generally would be recognized by Western as well as traditional Muslim scholarships, the principal glories of Islamic poetry are to be found amongst non-Arabs. Islam moves into the Iranian cultural sphere, and the Iranian cultural sphere, which hadn't had much by way of poetry, a few Pahlavi chants and royal processional marches and things, but not really very much before Islam, rapidly, by reconfiguring itself to accept the Islamic worldview, suddenly finds that its poetry takes off. Takes off in a way that we could say by common consent is incomparable amongst world poetic literatures. That it was amongst the Ajam rather than the Arab that poetry reached its highest Islamic consummation again and again, from the time of Sa'di to Firdausi to Nizami to Attar to Rumi. It was amongst the Ajam. And that's an interesting thing, that Islam touched those societies, and rather than the indigenous voice and sound and logic of the language just vanishing to be replaced by a ubiquitous Arabness, instead those languages, and necessarily the configuration of reality that they had historically borne, found a resurrection. We find the same with the languages of the Turks in Central Asia, the ancient Chagatai languages. A few shamanic chants have come down to us, but not really much. And despite the fact that Turkish in particular seems an unlikely candidate for the Arabic urud, or the meters, which is the condition for sound vertical production in Islamic civilization. Meters that originally operated according to the cadences and the internal rhythms of a Semitic language. Nonetheless, the Turkic language turned very quickly into a supreme vehicle for the expression of that metrical canon. And not just in Central Asia, but further east amongst the Uyghurs, further north to the Kazakhs, and then, of course, later on the Ottomans, etc. A remarkable circumstance that, unlike the early medieval period in Europe, where the high culture of poetry tended to be in Latin, and even as late in this country as, say, Milton, people are still writing a lot of Latin poetry. In the Islamic world, although the elites often wrote formal metaphysics and legal texts in Arabic as the kind of lingua franca of the ecumenical Islamic world, the poetic expression, which you could say was the one that was nearest to their hearts, poetry being next door to music, invariably represented a vindication and an expansion of the vernacular. And this is interesting. The Ottomans occasionally wrote Arabic poetry, but it was kind of dead, bookish, academic stuff. The same with the Persians, the same with Islam in India, in Sumatra and elsewhere. And that's a surprising circumstance. Why is it that the elite cultural production of the Muslim elites, rooted in scriptural vindication of the unique power of the Arabic language, did not result in an Arabic poeticism being the preferred discourse of the elites, because manifestly it did not? We might want to think about that. But in any case, what I'm driving at in this rather circuitous way is a cultural fact documented throughout our literature, which is that the arrival of the intellectual coordinates of the Islamic Tawheed worldview in a new cultural and linguistic space serves to reinvigorate that space rather than to extirpate it. And it's important to get our heads around that. Now, the present-day extension of that is the arrival of Islam in linguistic spaces that were historically anti-Islamic. Even languages like Chinese have had Muslim poetry for 1,000 years, but English, not really. Italian, no. Spanish, but only because of the Moriscos living under the yoke of the Inquisition, and even that is not so great. It's a kind of rap, really, a kind of protest, a last gasp of a defeated, resentful, extirpated, oppressed minority. It's not great Qasida literature. But Northern Europe, the last little bit of the ancient Roman world and its periphery that hadn't become Islam, Those languages are now engaging with Islam's way of viewing reality, and the results are going to be interesting. The question has to be, to what extent can the traditional practice of Islam in reviving a language also be expected to take place in English, French, Danish, Icelandic, who knows what? At the moment, we would say there's no sign of that particularly. And that also might give us pause. Why not? Why are we kind of uncomfortable when we express what is closest to our religious souls in the English language? When we sing in the English language, for instance, and actually it does seem to sound better, we think in Urdu or Turkish or Persian or Arabic, why is it that it seems a bit false when it's in English? Well, one response to that, I think, would be to say that it's just the novelty, that same falsity perhaps fell upon the ears of the first Persians who heard Persian used for Islamic categories, for the Turks and for others, but eventually the hybridization or the marriage becomes a successful one. So we shall wait and see. But in any case, the genre of the aphorism is one that is fairly universal. The Chinese have it. Confucius is basically aphorisms. The Taoist scriptures are basically disconnected aphorisms. And the Romans, of course, Seneca and Cato, the ancient Greeks, and in the medieval European tradition, the sentences of Peter Lombard and many others are aphoristic. It's not a specifically Islamic genre, but what we're dealing with here seems to be a conversation between a genre that is Islamic and a possible extension in the context of a literary space where the aphorism is used, but used rather differently. So let's just try and unpack that a little bit, because I think the question of the transposition of our thought world into the Anglo-Saxon semantic space is really important. And upon its successful completion is going to depend the success of a credible and sound, rather than artificial kind of vernacular Islam. That what is going on here is, first of all, the impact of an Islamic aphoristic genre that is rooted ultimately in what you might describe as an occasionalistic take on reality, and connected to a European genre of sentences or aphorisms or little disconnected thoughts, which are essentially anthologized collections of notions with a particular, usually philosophical or moralizing intention. And the maxims of La Rochefoucauld, which is one of the best known examples in European literature, would be an example of that. But I've said that it's something that's characteristically Islamic. And what I mean by characteristic is that it's rooted in the radical implications of Tawheed. We take monotheism to its logical conclusion, which is to say that Inna Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir, Allah is powerful over all things, doesn't just mean God could do anything if he wanted. It means he does do everything. And this is a radical monotheism from which some other monotheists have flinched, but it is certainly our position, and it's the qadar and the qada, and it's part of our Sunni aqidah. What is what the divine is doing, because there's nothing else out there that can be doing stuff. Everything is in the universal and unfailing grip of the divine power. That's what, for us, omnipotence signifies. And as a result, ideas of causality start to look strange. It's a little bit like some of those versions of string theory, where everything is possibly a particle, but it could also be a wave, it could be a form of radiation, Sometimes it seems to behave normally in time, sometimes it does very strange things in time, sometimes things go back in time, especially if you're near something like a black hole. And reality itself is in flux. It's not a standard Newtonian clockwork universe of measurable, predictable cause and effect. It's something dynamic. And monotheism, in its radical Islamic version, generates that. Everything is the consequence of the immediate divine action. It's not the consequence of some former event linked to it by allegedly incontrovertible physical laws, because quantum mechanics indicates that nothing is really a matter of certainty. It's probabilistic. That's the model that they like to work with. So we have this vision of the world as being not a piece of clockwork wound up while a deistic creator just watches to see what's going to happen, but instead a world in which the divine agency is total and uncompromising and direct at all times. So the Quranic worldview is occasionalistic, which is to say that everything is in a sense equivalently a manifestation of dimensions of the divine. There's no secular space there, and no principles that are outside the grip of the divine action that are interacting, that God waits to, that God is observing, that we observe. It's a notion of radical, but not monistic and not pantheistic, rooting of everything in the ground of the divine. And that's what the Quran says, where it says, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Wherever you turn, there is the face of God. So revelation is itself occasionalistic, and revelation itself provides the precedent for a vision of things which can tell stories, and we have plenty of stories, and much of our poetry is epic. You could say that the Khamsa of Nizami, some of the greatest poems that have ever been written, and throughout the Islamic world people continue to follow them. They're great stories. Our poetry can have the form of a saga, but it's also the case that our preferred form has not been the epic or the saga or the long extended poem, but shorter things. The qasida, the ghazal, and other things within those two ranges. And the characteristic form of the qasida and its other extensions in our civilization is that each verse is kind of independent of what goes before it and what comes after it. Sometimes it does tell a story, and in some of the early Arabic poetry, particularly the love poetry, Omar bin Abi Rabi'a, for instance, the story is 80, 90, 100 lines, baits in Arabic, and it's pursuing the maiden through the desert encampment, and there's a consummation. It's a story. But more commonly, Arabic poetry is atomistic and occasionalistic and aphoristic. The poetry of our civilization itself, which is probably our highest civilization accomplishment, is aphoristic. Despite the proliferation of other genres that we have, it is aphoristic in that very often, with Hafiz, for instance, you could take apart the individual lines and rearrange them. Most people wouldn't know the difference. It would still be a great poem. And that's quite uniquely Islamic, as far as I can see. Some of the great poets are ones where you get an apparent collage of lines that could be from anywhere, but somehow when placed together they create a particular affective state. So we would proceed from that observation to claim that there is something close to the heart of Islamic metaphysics about the aphorism, because of our idea of the world as being unified by Tawheed but radically disaggregated in our denial of natural causality. So we have this tradition that is rooted, I think, ultimately in the Quran itself, which you could experience as a set of aphorisms if you wanted. Not Muslims do experience it as an aphorism it's aphorisms more than story, because it's quotations. Most Muslims experience the Quran through hearing short chunks in the worship or just quotations being used here and there. But actually sitting down and reading the whole thing from cover to cover, apart from for devotional reasons, is quite an unusual practice. So even the revelation is, in this sense, aphoristic. Now, on top of that, we have built a culture of aphorisms, perhaps startlingly not a particularly abundant one, and the Hikam of Ibn Atta'illah is the most salient example with its endless commentaries. And obviously the idea of an aphorism opens the door to a commentary, because an aphorism is supposed to be pithy, ambiguous, difficult, pregnant, and invites commentary. So Ibn Atta'illah has the commentaries of Ibn Ajiba, Ibn Abbad al-Rundi, and so many others, Ahmad Zarruq, they go on and on. People are still writing commentaries on the Hikam of Ibn Atta'illah. And other examples, but generally, interestingly, it's not that abundant a genre in our literature. And perhaps the reason for that is that it doesn't have to be, because we already have in our poetry, particularly the ghazal and the qasida, an ample context for expressing things aphoristically. So far I've made the claim that this is a genre that is axiomatically Islamic. And then we need to see what happens when this genre, this atomized way of viewing the flux of the world that our senses perceive, works when it is put into the territory of a Germanic language. And here we could follow George Steiner and others who are almost deterministic in their idea that particular world views follow from the grammar and the syntax of particular languages. And he has some harsh things to say about German, for instance, which I think are a little bit overblown. If you read his book On Difficulty, he'll give you examples of how particular worldviews can be favoured by particular languages. I think that we need to be cautious of pushing that into deterministic direction, although in the 19th century it was a widespread view. The whole idea of a Semitic language, a Germanic language. To some extent these are racial and deterministic categories. But still, the question arises as to what happens when you take a language which from Islam's point of view is kind of virginal. It's not been used for Islam's tawhidic paradigm before, and seek to add it to that long list of languages which have been mobilized for the conveyance of the very particular truths of Islam. And to see ways in which that can be done without smuggling in resonances, preferences, memories of what was there before. Persian, before Islam, was used for Mazdaean, dualistic, Zoroastrian views, but they're not really perceptible in the great Persian Islamic poets. And in the case of English, we need to look at the vocabulary and to see the extent to which the vocabulary of the English language and all of the non-Muslim Western languages can be harnessed and turned to Islamic purposes. Very often amongst Muslims there is an instinct to stick with the Arabic vocabulary. I remember one of the first things I heard in the mosque in New York, African-American mosque, was somebody wanted to catch the Jamaat in the masjid. This is done in the African-American dialect. Catch the Jamaat in the masjid, and that seemed absolutely right. Every Muslim would know what that meant. What happens, however, when you start to use English terms, there it becomes more problematic. Is a Jamaat a congregation? Can you say congregation in a mosque without implying certain Christian ideas? Is a group of Muslim singers a choir or a chorus, or is that too Christian a term? If you use the word for long enough, does it shed its original resonances and starts to become something Islamic? This is something that we're all wrestling with. And by and large, one sees as the generations go by that the proportion of Arabic vocabulary in Muslim conversation tends to go down, and the proportion of the indigenous goes up. It's not necessarily a good thing, but it's something that's happening. So that I noticed the translator last night when he was translating Habib Muhammad al-Saqqaf's lecture was talking about God rather than Allah, for instance. Not all Muslims are happy with that, but somehow it's more acceptable to our ears than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. So the process whereby Allah migrated to become Khuda in the Persianate languages seems to be happening in the English language. And then some magical point is reached where the language becomes a lyrical and natural vehicle for the expression of something that's authentically Islamic. Now we would say that that's always possible, because the Quran has this very interesting take on what language is. How do we know God? Well, we can't see him because of what we are and what he, she, or it is, but instead we can infer reliably from signs, ayat. Signs in the Revelation, signs in the world, and signs in the world are of different registers. And one of the registers is اختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم. Of God's signs is the difference of your colours and your tongues. In other words, these are things to be celebrated. Because of these differences, signs of God exist. The divine plenitude, the peacock spreading its tail, the waterfall, the divine manifesting its names in the mystery of created manifestation, differentiation, is magnified by the plenitude of that differentiation. That includes languages as well. That's something that's, again, characteristically Islamic, because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the diversity of languages is regarded as the legacy of a curse, which is the Babel legend. That because of humanity's overweening desire to peruse the mysteries of heaven, God struck us down with a curse of mutually unintelligible languages. And the idea of Babel, people babbling to each other as being a great misfortune and the result of hubris and pride and a challenge to God. It's big in European literature. You can see, and painting as well, Bruegel's famous picture of the Tower of Babel, which is in Vienna, I think. And you can see people around it fighting. They don't understand each other because of their challenge to the divine. That story, unlike many other stories, is not present in the Quran. There's no Babel legend. There's two angels at Babel, but it's got nothing to do with the tower. So a big difference between the Judeo-Christian take on languages and the Islamic take on languages is that diversity is seen as a blessing, and that each language, implicitly, is also a sign. Just as each individual human being contains in a unique and irreplaceable way a particular way of demonstrating the truth of the hadith which says that Adam was created in the image of the divine, so also each language represents an important, irreplaceable component of a huge human picture, which again gives us many ways of looking up the same mountain. And that means that every language is capable of being incorporated as a fully adequate vehicle of Islamic expression. It has to be. There's no language that's kind of cursed that you're not supposed to use. And the incredible number of languages in the traditional Islamic cultural sphere, several hundred languages just in Muslim Indonesia alone, indicates that. So English, we know, theologically, is capable of being just as good as any other Islamic language. The extent to which Arabic vocabulary would enrich it as part of that process, or other interesting things might happen, such as the use of the Arabic script, which has historically accompanied Islamization, is something that is interesting, but doesn't really affect the main point that I'm making. So, the point of the contentions is primarily not so much to talk about Islam, but to see what divine indications are supplied, particularly by the English language. Are there particular sounds, insights, jokes, ways of understanding the paradox of reality which an English sentence can deliver, which perhaps an Arabic sentence can't? It's not that it's better, it's just that it's a particular way of looking up the mountain. It has its particular way of looking at the world, its particular strengths. Arabic has its weaknesses. For instance, there aren't many words for colours in Arabic. English has hundreds and hundreds of words for colours. So it could be that an apprehension of certain sacred truths can be supported very strongly and usefully, but in a non-polemical way, by the discovery of the luminosity inherent in the language, luminosity that's already sufficiently evident in the depth and the tenderness conveyed by much of the literature from George Eliot onwards, I suppose. We can see how some of the subtleties of the human soul can be conveyed through fine English writing, perhaps the greatest of all the languages for novelists. But what happens when Islam occupies that space? So really what the contentions are trying to do are to vindicate the Quranic precept of the spiritual indicativity of speech. Allamahu bayan. God taught us speech. It's not something that kind of popped up unbidden. It's something that is given to us, and that means all language. So the contentions are an exercise in excavation, archaeology, looking deep into these structures to see what there is in them that ultimately is going to disclose the presence of the divine. And it does seem to me that this is an important exercise for us who are often tongue-tied when we seek to express ourselves in the English language. Now, the form of the contentions, if you've looked at them, is not standardized at all. One of the advantages of using this kind of genre rather than, say, poetry is that you can be as free as you like. Some of them are short, some of them are long, some of them are witty, some of them are outrageous, some of them are obviously not meant to be taken seriously. Some are easy to understand, some even I don't understand. But the point is not to propose a truth, but to evoke an atmosphere. So you could say that, rather like our poetry, this is probably closer to music, or tries to be closer to music, than to standard prose, the conveyance of propositions and truth claims. It is conveying an atmosphere. So let's just have a look at a few of these indicative